All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to get started now. Thank you for joining this webinar presented by Innovate. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Innovate is a pan-Canadian network led by Sunnybrook Research Institute and supported by the Federal Government of Canada with the goal to harness breakthroughs in image-guided therapy through the integration of AI and machine learning techniques to advance medical imaging technologies. My name is Ahmed Nassif. I'm the Programs Manager for Training, Networking, and Outreach at Innovate. Excuse me. These webinars are a great way to hear firsthand from thought leaders, practitioners, and subject matter experts and key opinion leaders on a wide variety of topics related to the role of big data in the field of image-guided therapy and the associated challenges and fundamentals of integrating AI into health technologies. We're delighted today to have Dr. Brian Courtney, who will be talking about the status of the medical technology innovation in Canada with an emphasis on image guidance, AI, and digital health technologies. Dr. Courtney will also discuss some of the principles and models for collecting data and using data via data trusts and federated learning models, as well as the challenges associated with data sharing and utilization. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to go very quickly over the schedule and some of the ground rules for this webinar. Please note that this session is being recorded, and so by staying, you are giving us consent to record and archive the video. It will be available for later viewing with French subtitles on our website. The talk will last for like 45 or 50 minutes, and then we will have a 10 to 15-minute Q&A at the end of the session. If you have any question for our speaker, you can post them in the chat, or please use the raise your hand feature, which is available in Zoom to request to speak to the speaker. I would like to take this opportunity to announce that Innovate is now seeking applicants for its pilot fund for research and development projects that integrate image-guided therapy with artificial intelligence to advance medical innovation. Details are available at our website, innovate.ca, and I'll be posting the link in the chat as well. So shifting gears to today's session, our guest speaker, Dr. Brian Courtney, is an interventional cardiologist at Sunnybrook. He's a clinician scientist at Sunnybrook Research Institute, and he's the director of the Sunnybrook Medventions training program. He's co-founder and the chief medical officer at Canavi Medical. He's a co-inventor on over 15 issued United States patents and co-author on 18 peer-reviewed publications. His clinical activities are focused on coronary interventions and acute cardiac care, and his areas of research relate to minimally invasive imaging, medical device design, and medical innovation. Brian is also the director of the cardiac catheterization rotation for cardiology residents at Sunnybrook site for the University of Toronto. So without further ado, I'm passing this over to Brian to get us started.
Thanks very much, Ahmed. And thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to maybe suggest that this I should suggest to the audience to feel free to interrupt me pretty much at any time here. I've got a number of thoughts that are thrown in here just to talk about some trends and areas that I see as trends based on clinical experience lately and discussions with people in the healthcare space. And really forming some thoughts around an effort that we need to do as part of Innovate with respect to helping to provide some structures and some guidance to companies and researchers and government with respect to how data, large-scale data for healthcare, especially with respect to image-guided therapy, but healthcare more broadly gets formed. And so if people are interested in that topic or if they have questions about it as we go through this, please feel free to interrupt me. I'll talk to you a little bit about image-guided therapy and artificial intelligence and a few other topics related to that. In particular, what are some of the big global challenges and expectations and opportunities in medtech? How AI can potentially help with some of the challenges we have in healthcare right now, and in particular, how that relates to image-guided therapies, and talk a bit about some of the principles around access to data that enable AI-based algorithms and improvements in digital health. As a disclosure, I have started up a company called Canavi Medical, and I have a number of affiliations with it, and it certainly is part of the research track that I have within Sunnybrook as well. So high level, we have people that are living longer than they have ever before. You know, every year that goes by, the lifespan of Canadians increases by 2 months. And the number of people that come through my clinic or through the emergency room who need to get treated for a cardiac condition that have lived through prostate cancer and trauma care and orthopedic issues and neurologic stroke issues. You know, there's always something. It's never that this is their first encounter. It's rarely now that their presentation to me is their first encounter with the healthcare system in a meaningful way. And that adds a lot of complexity. The good news is we're all living longer and we're living better. But certainly it also adds a lot of strain to the healthcare system to keep up with that pace of innovation. A lot of treatments in the past have been based on medicines, and there are now a number of conditions that you can treat with more curative or more permanent type of procedures, and we'll talk about a few of those. And the benefits of doing procedural type treatments might be that you can not have to pay every day for taking a pill, that you might have fewer side effects, lower costs, and not really have to think about the disease as much as we go forward. When we do advanced procedures, whether it's open procedures or minimally invasive procedures or even completely non-invasive procedures, it requires typically a fair amount of understanding of the anatomy. People talk about precision medicine or personalized medicine, and they often think about the Genome Project. And you know, there's an anatomic equivalent of that, and that's imaging. Imaging tells us what is going on in our body, who we are as a person in terms of the differences of size and appearance. And that helps the therapeutic strategies to be more personally tailored to an individual, helps avoid complications and get better results in the long term. You know, Innovate came out of a grant application to the Strategic Innovation Fund. And this is where we asked our local information technology team here at Sunnybrook, how much of the data in this hospital is lab results, natural language texting, chart type data versus imaging. And 99% of the data in the hospital is imaging related. So that was kind of the thrust behind Innovate. And the whole hypothesis is we want to make it so that people have better data and better algorithms to guide their care and get the best possible outcomes. And because imaging is such a rich area for data that can teach us a lot about how we respond to treatments, who should get treated with what, did someone do a really good job or not when they got their treatment, and should perhaps even in the long stretch that provider or healthcare system get remunerated based on the quality of their outcomes as tracked by imaging, all remain interesting questions. So as I mentioned, you know, people have a lot of complexity to them these days. And this is a hypothetical, although not that far from hypothetical patient. 85-year-old gentleman who used to smoke, but he quit at the age of 60, a little bit of alcohol, and he's had multiple cardiac conditions, treated with angioplasty, a heart rhythm disorder, treated with an ablation procedure. Then his heart went too slow, so he got a pacemaker, orthopedic procedure, valve replacement, and then had a bit of a tremor and got a deep brain stimulator. And while he was getting worked up for his valve, was found that there was an early stage lung cancer, which got resected early. And this 85-year-old is a happy person who is at the gym, who is driving, who is working part-time as a consultant, more as a hobby than out of a need, and lives with his partner. And this is, you know, a fortunate person to have lived through all these things, to be doing as well as he is, but not entirely out of the realm of commonality in modern healthcare. And I think this is what it's going to look like in 2042 when Albert's son or daughter comes to the same age. Their heart attack will be treated with angioplasty, but it'll be guided with AI-enabled imaging to get a better result. The arrhythmia would have been detected on their watch, and then an ECG would have been analyzed by an algorithm saying, hey, this is a really good one to ablate, and this is where you need to ablate it, or this is the techniques that should be used for the ablation. The pacemaker that he gets is going to be not just a very basic rate responsive pacemaker where it guesses as to how much activity you're doing and then speeds up your heart rate in order to do so. but uses a number of multimodality sensors, both inside the pacemaker and outside the pacemaker, to determine how fast should the heart be going at this point for Albert's son to do as much activity as he is doing at that moment in time. The hip replacement will have more accurate alignment due to algorithms for optimizing that placement. The valve that gets implanted to treat the aortic stenosis would be placed in such a way that it doesn't cause conduction block that requires other treatment and is more likely to last more durably as a result of how it is aligned inside the heart. And the deep brain stimulator will be optimized using algorithms to modulate how the deep brain stimulation impacts the tremor that is being treated. And the CT scan automatically identified and notified the patient about the tumor, and they weren't relying on a very attentive radiographer to make that particular assessment. So just a few examples of where we are heading with respect to modern healthcare and its complexity. And this is actually a real patient here who is in their 80s, who has a transcatheter aortic valve implantation, who has a pacemaker in place, who has a heart rhythm disorder, and there's a little device here inside the left atrial appendage to prevent a stroke from happening. So this person doesn't have to take blood thinners to prevent a stroke. And then this structure along here is a number of coronary stents that were used in order to treat heart failure. And this person is much closer to a completely restored quality of life as a result of devices that are treating all of those what were previously life-ending conditions or life-limiting conditions. So when we're in the procedure room in the cath lab, a whole number of questions come up, and such as what size of devices should be used? Are we really certain about the diagnosis? What do we need to do to prevent future heart attacks? How aggressive do I need to be with the therapy? Have we given enough medicines to prevent a future heart attack or to prevent a blood clot inside this coronary stent? And do I feel comfortable sending this patient home sooner rather than later? And these are a lot of complex decisions to make all at the same time as a doctor is doing their procedure in the cath lab. And then you leave the cath lab and you go and talk to the patient and they want to know, hey, did you get a good result? How certain are you? Am I going to have another heart attack? Do I need to move on to open heart surgery? And when should I take my medications, or can I stop taking some of them because of the way that the condition has been treated? And these questions become so complex that we often, pre-pandemic, would put 10 or 15 people into this room and do case conferences to figure out how to manage patients who are going for cardiac surgery or other complex interventions. We now do this all on Zoom, obviously, as a result of the pandemic, and it's great that we accelerated to that. But there's a lot of knowledge that comes into this room based on pattern recognition over 200 person years of experience in treating complex cardiac patients. And is there a way that we can make that more accessible or more scalable so that others can benefit from that outside of the Sunnybrook environment, where we've now achieved a very low mortality rate for coronary artery bypass grafting? If you think about artificial intelligence, really medicine is around decision making followed by action. And if you're able to make decisions by having the best group of experts available, then that's great, but that's often not accessible or affordable. And if there are ways we can automate some of this and free up time so that doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers can spend more time talking with patients to say, hey, what's important for you? These are the things we could do. These are implications. These are the risks associated with the next step in your therapy. But I want to know more about what you feel about this. What are your goals in life? What are you willing to tolerate? What do you value? And really spend more of that important time between healthcare providers and patients to help with the decision-making process. If we can offload some of the burden of assimilating or aggregating data and then processing that data to make best recommendations, then that is a way that artificial intelligence brings physicians and other healthcare providers closer to their patients, rather than the opposite, which is often thought about when you think of AI, where it depersonalizes medicine. And then this slide, which I first made about a year ago, said there is a healthcare cost crisis that is about to worsen with aging demographics higher expectations and the post-COVID era. I can without a doubt say that I've had to change that from a future tense to a current tense statement because we have real issues currently in healthcare where we've taken what was expected to be a requirement of ramping up our resources for aging demographics and more complex care over 10 years. We've had to squish that into 12 to 18 months of time because of the way that COVID and the resurgence of other viral illnesses is currently impacting our healthcare system and how that's changed our healthcare human resource issues. I'm going to talk a little bit more just about imaging and AI and then come back to some of the trends in the healthcare system that I think are incredibly relevant. But if we think about imaging and a CT scan and how much information is inside a CT scan, we always think that these CT scans are, focused in a particular area, but certainly if there are things that we can do to, determine, is there a pneumonia, which is the question that often gets asked of a radiologist when a CT scan is ordered. But if we can make scores about, well, what's the risk of atherosclerotic disease based on what we see in the vessels? Is there any calcium in these vessels? Do they look like they're thickened? Here you can see in the coronary arteries of this patient, there's a little bit of calcium with these bright little specks. That often doesn't get reported on in a CT scan, even though the imaging information is readily available. It's not the question that was asked by the doctor that ordered the CT scan, therefore it might not make it into the report. Is this patient at risk of bone fractures? Are they frail? Maybe they're coming to the emergency room from time to time, and on one of those visits, we need to interrogate their pacemaker, but neither the patient nor the records tell us the brand of pacemaker that is inside the patient. If the CT scans automatically detected that, it might provide real quick information that could be used, or even a chest x-ray could do that for that matter, to tell us which device should we be using to interrogate that pacemaker and figure out why it's not working. Are there things around visceral body fat that we should be passing on to the patients to help them with lifestyle modifications, as another example? So there's a lot of data inside these CT scans that do not make it into the 200 to 1,000 word text-based reports that come out from a radiologist that could be systemically integrated and provide more information to the patients so that they can make decisions or so that they can be alerted to other conditions of interest. My area is coronary artery disease. I look after patients who are having heart attacks or heart failure. And this is an example of the kind of plaque that causes heart attacks. Conavi, the company that I provided a disclosure for, we make imaging devices that image plaque using ultrasound and optical technologies. This is what the histology looks like, but you can't get this picture in a live patient. This is from an autopsy specimen. It'd be great to be able to look at pictures with this level of detail and information to know what is happening inside a coronary plaque in more detail than what we currently get in the clinic. And we've been working on algorithms where we take ultrasound and optical images and combine them or overlay them, and then use AI algorithms to train those algorithms as to what the histological composition is most likely to be underneath, and generate masks of where do we think there's calcium, how much lipid is there, how much fibrous tissue is there, generate some quantitative scoring and some automated interpretation to help physicians make decisions in the cath lab, as well as to characterize the burden of disease in patients in the long term, all using neural networks and other artificial intelligence tools in order to get more information readily available to the physician than they can get purely from their grayscale images of ultrasound or optical imaging at the same time. There are some very significant trends in healthcare that I've alluded to, and they're putting big pressures on. And one of the asks of this talk was to talk about where there might be some opportunities. And without a doubt, we have to continue working on technologies that treat what was previously untreatable, or improve diagnostic accuracy, or improve quality of life for patients. All of those important outcomes where developing new therapies and diagnoses is incredibly important. Those become less relevant when you're in a world where there are more vacant positions in the emergency room than there are nurses on the roster. And the number of people that we need to provide acute care on the front line or in important administrative jobs in healthcare is growing. There are over 50,000 funded job vacancies in healthcare in Ontario and 150,000 job vacancies in Canada right now. Even Sunnybrook alone has 1,000 job openings posted on its website at this point. And it's happening because of healthcare workers approaching retirement, competing opportunities outside of healthcare or within healthcare, but in less demanding parts of healthcare, higher risk work environments, and increased complexity. And our wait times that we work so hard to reduce for cardiac surgeries and orthopedic surgeries, et cetera, have gone up again. And so what this means, it's a little bit of an alarm bell, is that we need to, A, train people to fill this gap, and we need to make sure that the innovations that we bring forward to healthcare are going to, in some way, positively impact these issues that we're facing, where the healthcare system has a real strain taking place on it at this point. And it's not just in Canada, this is happening all around the world, where the demand for healthcare services and technology is going up, while the supply of some of the most critical aspects, in particular healthcare human resources, is going down. So things that are going to be urgent and durable needs, and I add durable because when COVID came out, there was a lot of talk around everyone pivoting to making protective personal equipment and various tests and therapies for a pandemic that still is going to affect us on an ongoing basis. But there are other needs that are going to be less limited in terms of the time span where they're a problem. And any innovations that can help us result in shorter hospital stays, avoiding costly intensive care treatment, enabling treatment at home, enabling people with lower skill sets to deliver care or allowing them to focus more effectively on the care that they're delivering will be important. Avoiding readmissions and repeat procedures and reducing costs. And of course, we always want better treatments and better treatment support tools, but hopefully they are aligned with some of these important themes that impact the capacity of the healthcare system in a positive way, because we are in desperate need of that at this point. Data in healthcare is growing considerably. This is a trend that is very present in medical imaging. There are a number of companies making wearable technologies, some of them based here in Toronto. We've all heard about, mobile devices and how they track our every move, and how the Public Health Agency of Canada was using some of that data, which we'll come back to during the pandemic, to see how mobile people were when there were lockdowns in place. There's a ton of data in genomics, and you can now get whole genome sequencing very quickly in people at a fraction of the cost that it used to take. Digital commerce continues to grow, and there's a big portion of healthcare expenditure that will be traveling over to the e-commerce space at some point, if it hasn't already. And we hand a lot of data over to companies that are interested in either our family backgrounds or our genetics or our prescription patterns. And so there's a ton of data that's out there, and the ability to use AI in order to analyze that data and to make discoveries for things in the future is very real, and it's very pronounced, and there's a high level of interest in it, and there's a high level of talent available to leverage that interest. But then we have to sit back and think about all the issues that come up with respect to large data sets, such as privacy and confidentiality, hackers using it for exploitation. Sometimes when a patient discloses something about their health status, it also affects others that are genetically related to them, whether it's in their social communities or their immediate family members. And certainly risks to security, where laws around what kind of procedures get done in which jurisdiction and whether that's allowed or not allowed in other jurisdictions. You can imagine that can create issues at the borders of in various circumstances, and doesn't take long for political tailwinds to shift direction to make issues for people as they try and go from one part of the world to the other. So if we think about what the potential of large data volumes and artificial intelligence combined together for image-guided therapy is, It's to improve diagnoses, to identify rare but significant pathologies that might otherwise get missed if they were not looked for specifically, improving image quality, improving clinical workflows. For example, if someone comes in at 2 in the morning with a stroke and you don't have a technologist for the CT scanner readily available, but you can rely on some simple algorithms to protocolize and acquire that data and have one less highly skilled healthcare worker available 24/7 to do that work, that certainly can be very valuable. And it becomes even more important when you get to MR imaging, which is a bit more technologically complex and customized. You can refine people's prognoses, provide decision support tools. And I think this latter point of assessing quality of care is also an important one I want to talk about a bit briefly as well. You know, when we talk about healthcare in the 21st century, there are a number of reports out there that are fairly consistent, supported by meta-analyses and administrative databases, et cetera, that roughly 25 to 30% of the healthcare dollars spent don't provide improved healthcare outcomes for patients. And it's really, really difficult to identify that or to track that. People often talk about value-based healthcare where, hey, if I'm going to spend an extra dollar in healthcare, am I getting the value out of that I might relative to spending it on another technology or going to a different service provider? And we have a very hard time measuring value or quality. One of the things which is a pitfall from an ethical or social perspective with artificial intelligence is it's heavily prone to reinforcing biases that exist systematically. And this has been raised a number of times with respect to things like criminal intelligence software and surveillance software. But it might be something where that non-biased nature of artificial intelligence, which is a significant social dilemma in some contexts, might be advantageous when it comes to measuring quality outcomes in healthcare and remunerating or encouraging healthcare systems and physicians that do high quality care to get appropriately remunerated for that or incentivized for it. Right now, if you were to go to the Mayo Clinic and ask them what their cardiac surgery mortality rate is, let's hypothetically say it comes back at 3%. And then you were to go down the street to the local community hospital and ask them what their cardiac mortality rate, they'll say it's 3%. And the reality is that the cases showing up at the Mayo Clinic or at the Cleveland Clinic are going to be very likely to be more complex than those that are routine cases done at a center that treats mostly common conditions as opposed to complex congenital conditions, for example, or transplant patients. And so if there were ways to objectively and fairly reduce the measures of what is a difficult case, what is an easy case, and did we get a good result or did we not get a good result for that patient relative to its complexity, then we have a mechanism to start incentivizing people to more aggressively keep their skills up, to take the time it takes to do detailed jobs during a procedure, because often extra details take more time. And humans are humans and they follow incentives, and behavior follows incentives. So if there are ways that we could normalize or identify quality healthcare, whether that's at the time of diagnosis, at the time of treatment, or in the follow-up period, as I've outlined in this example on the screen, then that might be a very interesting application of using artificial intelligence to appropriately incentivize the system such that we get this 25 to 30% of wasted healthcare dollars down to the single digits. Now, whenever you talk about artificial intelligence, you need data, and a lot of people need access to data. And the reasons why are to develop the algorithms for academic research. Engineers need access to data if they're going to build new algorithms or build new technologies and assess how those technologies work well. Physicians and patients want to have access to analyses of data to determine what the best path forward for them might be based on what other groups have gone through. And certainly regulators are interested in access to data so that they can get early signals as to where devices or drugs might potentially be causing harm that might not otherwise be detected. And payers are going to be interested in access to data to make sure that they're getting that value for their healthcare dollar that is spent in large patient populations, and be able to bring that down to the granular level of, do we have to buy this particular service or this particular test for this particular patient? There are other people that want access to data, and it'll be for different reasons. People who want to use it for direct marketing or market launch strategies. Certainly, legal authorities might have interest in very personal parts of data that is usually protected through a physician-patient relationship. Employers, insurers, and lenders, and people who are doing hacks to seek ransom. And we have two people here who recently were involved in an election in the state of Pennsylvania, and the issues of the health records of one of the candidates became a significant part of that discussion. And certainly the outcomes of even something which might not seem to impact the world much in terms of an election in a small territory can certainly have very large ramifications when it goes forward and gets scaled because of fence border decision making, majority rules type decisions that have to be made in electoral systems. So, there's a lot of players who want to do malicious things with healthcare, and there's some really good things that we can do with healthcare. And so a number of principles we have to think about. Who owns the data? And in Canada, this has gone to the Supreme Court. In essence, the patients own the data, and the hospitals and the clinic own a patient's records. And so the patients have the right to access their data. They have the right to have it corrected. It becomes a little bit more fuzzy in Canada as to specifically who gets to determine where that data goes and what can be done with it and who benefits the most from it. I think there's still a bit of gray area in that area. If anyone on the call has insights they want to add to that, I'd certainly welcome them as I start thinking about this kind of work in greater detail. Aside from hospitals and clinical records, where else might data come from? Certainly, there have been a number of publicly accessible repositories of things like chest x-rays and lab results and pseudo populations or de-identified populations of patients for people to work with. Pharmacies generate massive amounts of data based on prescription patterns. There are huge amounts of billing records, administrative records. Mobile devices are tracking things that we do all the time with geolocation. I'm very hesitant to look up anything on Google on a patient of mine when they're in my clinic, because I'm pretty sure that someone somewhere knows the patient is in my office, and they know that I'm in my office. And is there some way that if I were to link a search while they are in the office to something related to their medical condition, could those be tied together in some way? Might sound a little paranoid, but certainly it is theoretically and technically possible, and is something that people have to be wary of. And there are even people who are in the business of data brokerage, where they acquire data from all of these sources, aggregate them, and either analyze them or transfer them or provide services to, in some cases, answer very bona fide questions that are in the interests of the patients in whom that data came from. And in other circumstances, maybe the question might be, well, is this being used to market something to me more effectively that otherwise might not have bought or might not have drawn my attention to, and other applications of it. So certainly there's a whole industry behind data, some of which is certainly behind the curtains that many of us and certainly most patients are not aware of. Even asking questions on a data search, the question, in fact, is the data. In other words, if you're looking up a particular disease, the number of searches around COVID, when COVID came up, clearly identified the number of people that were interested in that, and certainly tracking vaccination questions and other questions of that nature through search engines provided a fair bit of data that could be tracked to users based on their identification and how they log in to get that data from search engines. And when we think about data management, we have to think about a number of things. There's the security of the data in terms of its technical security as to how prone it is to getting hacked, maintaining the privacy and confidentiality And also the right for getting consent or limiting the right to use that data to specific situations when consent is provided and not using it in the absence of consent. And there are principles around that we'll talk briefly. Another question that comes up often is the rights to benefit. If someone else is using my data, why is that okay without me getting some of the benefit of it? And yeah, I think there are situations where it can be argued that would be okay, but it's a reasonable question to ask. Who else has rights to access that data, to ask for it to be erased? And in Europe, there's this whole concept of the right to be forgotten about. If you want to bank out of people having digital records of certain parts of your activities with some significant limits associated with it, but nonetheless, if you want to tell a big tech company to say, take everything you know about me off, you can ask that with some limits. People want the right, if their data is being used, to actually engage in the process of how that data is used. And they might also want to either prevent the use of their data through various processing means or restrict how their data is processed. And there's a number of advocacy groups. There's one started by a skin cancer group called Save Your Skin, but they've actually gotten sign-on from a number of other patient advocacy groups around a declaration around healthcare data management that includes a lot of these concepts embedded within it. Certainly, as I mentioned, there are people who buy, sell, and trade health information, and the public is increasingly becoming more aware of it. You know, the title of the Scientific American sounds like, you know, these might be malicious brokers. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case, but certainly people are not aware about it, and that can certainly be off-putting. And if it is being used maliciously, that certainly is a problem. I wouldn't dare say that that is the case in the circumstances being presented by this article, but it certainly is theoretically possible. And there was a negative reaction from a large portion of the population. You know, certainly some people might have advocated for the fact that Public Health Agency was tracking people during the lockdown to get a sense of you know, what was happening and were they being effective in getting their lockdown measures in force. And other people might be grossly offended by this and find this to be a gross intrusion of privacy. And I think that regardless of which angle someone has, the perceptions here matter. And if people start using data without getting the proper safeguards put in place or without the proper transparency, then there's going to be negative reactions to that, and it's important to manage that effectively. There are a few important references I'd like to draw people's attention to. One of them is the Declaration of Helsinki, and this is for medical research. This is basically the principles that guide the vast majority of research ethics boards around the world. And it primarily relates to how physicians perform medical research. It's a collection of about 30 principles. And it does have a clause in it that says if people are using identifiable human material or data, that you need to get informed consent for its use, its collection, and its storage. There may be exceptional circumstances where you could use that data without getting explicit consent, but only after approval through Research Ethics Committee, and it has to be balanced relative to the risks of how that data is being used and what perceptions of that use might potentially be if it were to be revealed that this in fact had been used for the purpose that was proposed. And a lot of people, you know, a few keywords, identifiable. People often use the de-identification of data as a rationale to say, well, it's de-identified, so it doesn't matter, therefore we can pass it around freely. And certainly there is a huge issue with transmitting identifiable data with personal health information directly attached to it. But we also need to make sure that people don't get too comfortable with the fact that de-identified means permanently de-identified, because there's a whole field around re-identification of data that I'll come to shortly. And there's also obviously a gray area with respect to impracticable to obtain consent. You know, if you have to go and get written consent from 3,000 people because you're looking at 3,000 people's CT scans, is that too impractical to get their explicit consent for? I think a lot of people would argue it probably is, and it has to be balanced against the risks of using that data, including re-identification. But if you're not exposing them to any new treatment, changing their management plan, and the data was collected for reasons that were part of regular healthcare, you could make an argument, and it often is made, to go ahead and do that. But certainly there are a lot of levels of gray in different places where you could put your threshold at which something is acceptably impracticable and that the benefits outweigh the risks. So there's a gray area here, and I just wanted to make sure people were aware of that. There are a lot of laws of relevance in the US. It's the HIPAA, which talks in the title about health insurance, but in fact, a large portion of the act is around how medical records are managed by healthcare providers and how personal health information is managed with business associates. A very important act to be aware of, even though it is expired and no longer in force, is the Patriot Act. On the flip of a dime, the US government gave broad-reaching powers to agencies, including intelligence groups and border groups and others, that allowed them to look into any data that was within the reach of American companies and American institutions, including medical records, many of which were medical records of Canadians, such as people in British Columbia and Nova Scotia. And this drew into the limelight the need for domiciled storage of data for things that are of a high sensitivity, such as medical records. And we just have to be aware that this kind of thing could easily come up again if there was a reactionary legislative activity, whether it's in the US or in any other jurisdiction or what have you, where data isn't necessarily going to be protected in perpetuity by contracts and by good faith, and could certainly be expropriated for reasons that people might not wish it to be expropriated for in the future. PIPEDA and PHIPA, these are the Canadian and provincial rules, and Ontario rules, but there are other rules similar to PHIPA in other provinces, which are basically, in many respects, similar to how personal health information and electronic records get distributed and used in our own jurisdiction. The Europeans recently came out with GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulations. And this has impacted a large number of the big data-rich tech companies like Google and Facebook. They can actually get penalized for up to 4% of their annual revenues if they're in violation of GDPR. And this imposes regulations on companies that, even if they aren't domiciled in the EU, but if they process data on people in the EU, then they have to follow these rules. And so it's just something to point attention to. Similarly, in China, as genome sequencing came out, the government in China became very sensitive to sending any sort of genetic information out of the borders of China to multinational companies or multinational research agencies. And they then added onto this the Personal Information Protection Law. And now they have very strict and arduous control on exports of medical data, not just genetic data, especially if it's patient-specific medical data, whether that's in the form of a clinical trial, whether that's in the form of event reporting, or what have you. There are a lot of controls in China because I think they've realized the potential for how individual personal health information could potentially be exploited in an unfavorable manner. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of rules or laws stop applying once data is de-identified, and that gives people a certain level of comfort. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that there remains a significant risk of re-identifying that data, and that corresponds to the size of the data set, how connective or how easily relinked that data set is to other parts of data, whether it's mobile app geolocation data, or if you're superimposing one study on top of another study, you could potentially relink an ultrasound study to an MRI study, for example. And here's a neat little publication where you can see how a CT scan, which we often think of as looking at the inside of the body, but it also shows the outside of the body and the facial features, and you can map that to the publicly available pictures of prominent radiologists in Canada with the right technology. And certainly as we get more and more data and it's more linked, this becomes an increasing risk for re-identification. In fact, there was a publication in Nature published, I've got the link for it here, where they took one of these large X-ray databases that have been made publicly available, and they were able to re-identify or relink various chest X-rays to the same patient with greater than 95% accuracy, even when those X-rays were taken as far as 10 years apart from each other, match them to the same patient. So we need ways to manage data and get the benefits of artificial intelligence while protecting data management principles to protect patients. And one way to do it is to get consent on every study and every analysis that is done, and certainly that is the most visible and transparent and perhaps the least immediately controversial, although you could argue that there would be a controversy around how that prevents anything from getting done at the scale that could potentially be achieved, and that might potentially limit a lot of the benefits that come from these new technologies and large data pools. So this does have some limits in terms of practicality as we scale things up to larger data sets. And it also, the consent process does lead to selection bias in the data. People who are more likely to consent might be of a particular age group or socioeconomic group, and that in and of itself might be disadvantageous to those groups. If you can get exemptions from consent from the Research Ethics Board in low-risk studies, that might be reasonable. There's always a risk of perception about this, and some of the risks that might have been foreseen, or there might be some unknown risks at the upfront part of proposing a study that uses AI and big data. And two other potential mechanisms out there: data trusts, where we build a governance structure along with the database. And I would say that perhaps even the governance structure is a larger portion of the activity than the technical aspects of managing and analyzing the data. This has a high overhead, but it allows large groups of organizations to put data into a shared inventory, to have access to the benefits of the data while not having access to the specifics of the data, and provide some consistency and protective measures. And I'll show some examples of that in a moment. And the other option is don't transfer the data, but transfer the algorithms. And this is called federated learning. And I'll give a quick description of that. Data trusts, as I said, are data sets that are curated by a governance structure with principles around that data set and how it's going to be used, and appropriate technological infrastructure to ensure its security and its appropriate use. And it should have a particular limited set of purposes. And I looked up healthcare data trusts. I actually went to PubMed and typed in data trust or data trust. I was surprised. There were only 40 or 50 results published in PubMed, one of which was an article I was a co-author on. And yet data trust is a concept that is out there and being used quite a bit. There's one data trust in Florida where a number of academic and private healthcare providers have pooled the data on 17 million patients together. And they've got a review process, and you can propose a query. It'll go through a Research Ethics Board and Executive Review Committee, and then it'll get approved. And then the data will be provided as the output of that, while all of this data remains within a protected structure. They've been able to publish on hypertension, cancer, birth rates, get some information about how claims are managed, infant mortality rates, and a fair bit of other work through this large data trust, which is reflective of a population that's probably on average 5 to 10 years older than the rest of the United States. There's another one called the High Value Healthcare Collaborative, and this involves groups like Northwell and Providence, Intermountain Healthcare, and the Mayo Clinic, very large US-based institutions. You can see here it's got a governance committee with a board of directors and then an executive committee for each of these committees. The one that does when we think about data and AI from a technical perspective or a technology development perspective, this is the bucket here. This is when we're doing discovery and dissemination on the data. But there's a number of other committees with respect to how the operations of the data trust operate that are equally important and of the same magnitude of scope. About 3 years ago, we published a Canadian initiative to talk about some requirements for establishing and operating data trusts. And a few examples of things that are thought to be minimum requirements of such a structure would be that there's legality of the operations that take place and insurance of that, a governance structure, a management team, data user requirements to make sure they're authorized users, and some element of public and stakeholder engagement to involve the people that would be interested in knowing how data is being used and keeping all those activities on board. You know, it's really interesting. I'm on our research ethics board here at Sunnybrook, and we sometimes bring in patient participants. We always have community participants, but we often have patient representatives come in for specific protocols that we might be reviewing, and often get an enthusiastic response about saying, yeah, please go and do what you can to help us learn more about this disease that's affected my family member. And don't get too carried away on some of these governance issues, but it only takes one fault of a data breach or one bad event to cause a lot of potentially beneficial research and developments to take place to cause that to fall apart. Certainly, data trusts are also a thing in the UK, and they've gone a bit further along than perhaps we have in Canada in some respects with respect to the data structures they put together through their publicly funded healthcare system. And then there's this concept of federated learning where you don't send the data anywhere. The data stays exactly where it is. Sunnybrook's data would stay where it is. UHN's data would stay where it is. University of Calgary or Foothills Hospital would keep its data on its servers. But you send the parameters and the model or the neural network around and iteratively train it on the data at each of these institutions, and then end up with a model that benefits from the data across multiple institutions while not having access or risks from the data directly being exposed outside of the institutions in which it's been held and which own the data. A bit more around federated learning and PubMed in the literature than there was on data trusts for what it matters. So that's a fairly long talk. It's not strong on details. It's very high level. I myself am a clinician. I think there are full-time people out there that purely work on these issues day in, day out, and understand this far more than I do. You know, happy to give this talk and provide some thoughts. And I think that there is a great need for us to create structures and policies that help us to ensure that we maintain public trust in how healthcare data is used for their good, including their own healthcare, academic research, even potentially commercial research when there are appropriate guardrails on that, and allow us to make new technologies that help us to relieve the significant strains on our healthcare system and also improve our quality of life and survival. So just a few final thoughts, and happy to take any questions that people might have based on that. Happy to see a lot of familiar names in there, including a few people whose research I meant to put a little check mark on to say, hey, thank you for attributing that. Elias, I'm speaking specifically of you with respect to this work that you did with us in terms of doing AI for tissue characterization. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Brian. Very eye-opening talk with a lot of great insights on how the exploding AI field has really opened the door to a new era of research with immense potential and impact, not just on the image-guided intervention side, but more broadly, as you mentioned, on medicine and quality of patient care. Just quickly before I open up for questions, a quick reminder that this session is being recorded, and by staying, you are giving us consent to record and archive the video. Okay, so questions time. You can either post the questions in the chat or you can use the raise your hand feature. I can start. I do have a quick question for you, Brian. You haven't highlighted some of the ways to manage data and get benefits of AI, and also discuss some of the concerns and barriers to unlocking the power of health data, including privacy, security, and risk of exploitation. I'm wondering, what can the Canadian government policymakers do to mitigate some of these risks and, perhaps promote interoperability and data sharing?
Yeah, those are two very different questions. So interoperability is all about the technical aspects of being able to share the data and move it around. They encourage that through their funding programs and through how they procure their own IT systems. It's a very big topic right now for the provincial health ministers and the premiers and the federal government, because the provinces are asking the government for more money for healthcare. And the government's saying, if you want more money for healthcare, we want to know that it's going to improve outcomes, and we want access to your data for that. And so that is, one sort of topic. But I think separately, they've been doing a reasonable job over the course of the past 4 years of doing landscape surveillance of what are the risks, what is needed for managing personal data, whether it's healthcare data or other non-healthcare related data. They came out with what was this digital charter of rights in 2018, which had 10 principles around what people might want to expect, but it certainly didn't have anything legal behind it. It was non-enforcing. It was really a concept presentation as opposed to a real strong either policy or legal framework. But they are moving forward with, there's a bill going through Parliament right now with respect to advancing some of the principles in that digital charter of rights to give some clarification. And I think, some people in industry or advocates of big data and AI might think that this is going to be a friction point for them being able to do what they want. But if it actually lays out the guardrails and says, hey, this is what you can do and can't do with a bit more clarity than what currently exists, then that gives people a bit more of an ability to say, hey, these are areas where we can, move forward and feel comfortable in doing so, and not be worried about, a legal framework that is not matured enough yet to really know what it might be when you actually get to wanting to act on it, or you build something that has to fall apart after the fact because it's not in bounds within whatever the new legal framework might be.
Thank you very much.
Certainly the data trust working group within Innovate is also something that the government's expecting feedback on to help with respect to, how all of the money they spend on health research can be more effectively used and promote more data sharing between provinces and regions so that we learn more from each other.
Right. Thank you.
There's a question about synthetic medical data. And synthetic medical data, just to make sure I have the right interpretation of it, you're talking about data that basically takes people's records from real healthcare system, and then you manipulate the lower fidelity bits and bytes of it to try and give data that, from a statistical perspective, is representative of a patient population, but it's not so specific that it can actually be used for re-identification. Is that what you're talking about when you talk about synthetic medical data?
Yes.
So certainly it is an approach, and it really depends on the fidelity of the signal. A lot of AI algorithms are very dependent on the granular parts of the details. If you look at a chest X-ray, some of the fine details in a chest X-ray might be related to the lower order bits of data and how they're arranged with each other. If you were to filter them out, then it wouldn't be as useful. When it comes to some tests like lab work, and you say, oh, my hemoglobin on this day was 85, but we're going to say, or it was 85.2, but we're going to say it's 85.4 to de-identify the data. Those sorts of things probably provide a marginal amount of protection, but they don't provide the likelihood of those sorts of details coming out as actually being all that useful in the algorithm might also be lower as well. There's another principle called K-anonymization. In other words, if you can reassure yourself that if you're going to send data out, and if it were to be re-identified, that that they would have at least a hard time tracing it to 100 or more people, for example, because it's not so easily re-identified beyond any with any more granularity beyond, let's say, 100 people, then that is kind of a marker or a test that people have proposed to say, hey, this data is adequately de-identified, that it cannot be re-identified. But exactly how that's implemented and how well it's proven is very context specific.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Brian. I'm just mindful of our time. It's already past 2 o'clock. So if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to email them to me, and I'll be happy to connect you with Dr. Brian Courtney. Brian, it was a real pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. And thank you very much to our attendees for joining us. And since this marks our last event of the year, we are looking forward to see you and host you in future events in the new year.